Hey guys, welcome back. Today, I want to return to a series that we were recording earlier, and that is hashtag why I am not a Calvinist. And the idea is not to fight with Calvinists, but just to show that these are reasons why I don't subscribe to that particular worldview. There've been a lot of other videos that I've been wanting to make here recently. And so I haven't made any on this lately, but I wanted to return to that today. And here's the topic. Is the gospel veiled or hidden to the people who don't believe? That obviously is a Calvinistic thought that the people who God has not chosen to be saved, they're just not going to get it. It's not that they can't understand it at all, to be able to explain it, but they're just not going to get it because, they're not going to believe because they haven't already been given that faith by God. So the passage we're going to look at today, a couple verses, we're going to find them here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. It says, "But even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them." So in full disclosure, I'm not sure that this is a passage that Calvinists use as one of their main passages, but I have heard it used this way. And you might read that, you might wonder, well, wait a minute here. People who haven't been chosen to be saved, the gospel is veiled, so they can't understand, right? Well, I don't think that's what he's talking about here. So what does it mean that the gospel is veiled to people? Well, Paul is actually talking about here in chapter 4. It's a concept that he has been talking about in the previous chapter 2, back in chapter 3. And what he's actually doing is he's building on his idea about how Moses came down from the mountain. He talks about what we read about in the Old Testament. Moses received the 10 commandments from God, which were kind of the beginning of the law, if we can put it that way. He received the 10 commandments from God, and he came down the mountain, and his face was glowing from that encounter with God, so much so that the people said, "We can't even look at you, Moses, with the glowing on your face." And so he put a veil over his face to hide it. And so in effect, what was happening was because the people could not see the shining on Moses' face, the glory of the 10 commandments was being hidden from them to a degree. And we say, how can commandments have glory? It's because they showed us what God wanted us to live like, specifically at that time for the Israelites. This is what God wants things to be like. And because Moses hid this veil, they couldn't really grasp the concept of how awesome of a thing this really was. So that's Paul's thought here. The idea of putting a veil over something was to hide it a little bit so you can't completely see it, kind of like a bride would do at a wedding, even though it's a very, almost invisible veil. She puts it over to give that division there, to kind of hide a little bit until it's lifted. So the 10 commandments were beginning basically of the law, and they were that glorious. And Paul's discussion here that he's getting at is, if the law is that glorious, where it would cause Moses' face to shine just when he's having an encounter with God, how much more the gospel? The gospel that doesn't require us to obey all these details of the law, how much more glorious is that? So now let's return to our verses here with that in mind. He says, "But even if our gospel is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing." In other words, they can't see it completely. They don't completely get it. "Whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them." So the veil hides something, and the gospel is hidden from people. And by the way, I'm going to attach a link to this in this video to a document that I've written with a lot more details. I don't want to go through all the details in hopefully a short video, but you can read it more if you want to see more about what Paul is talking about back there in chapter 3. But what he's saying here is that there's this veil that's between a person and God. And that veil, that blindness, has to be removed in order for them to really get the gospel, to really understand it. Well, how can that blindness be removed? That's our question. What has to happen for that blindness to be removed? Well, just so happens that Paul told us back in chapter 3 here in verse 16, where he is discussing how people who do not accept Christ cannot completely understand the purpose of the Old Testament. They don't really get it because it's explained more in Christ. If you don't believe Christ, then the Old Testament's not going to make as much sense to you. And so he's talking about that, and he says this about these people who don't understand it. "Nevertheless, when one turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away." So what is the response when someone doesn't completely get it? They need to turn back to the Lord. Now that is what opens their eyes. They were blinded before, and that is what opens their eyes to the truth of both the Old Testament and the gospel. So their minds need to be unblinded. Well, how does this happen? How can you unblind your mind? Well, how do you unblind your mind about anything? If there's something you don't completely grasp and you're kind of blinded to it, what do? You study it. You try to find accurate truth about that particular thing. And so let me just speak to a couple different kinds of people here. One type of person that might be watching this video is you're someone who doesn't believe. You don't believe the gospel, right? Maybe you've looked at it. You can understand it. You can even explain it to someone, but you don't understand it in your heart sense. You're not grasping it as, yeah, this is real. This is the thing that I really need to put my faith in. You don't believe it. Okay, this is what I would encourage you to do, to open your mind to whatever is true, to follow the truth wherever it leads. Embark on a serious consideration of Christianity. Allow yourself to see it through to its logical conclusions, what you study. Here's some questions that I would recommend that you ask. Okay, ask yourself and study these out. And there's so many more, but these are just some to begin with. How and why did everything begin to exist? Is there anything, or is there any objective basis for right and wrong? Is there any objective basis for morality? Were the scriptures given to us by God, or are they just a compilation of man's thoughts? Does anything exist outside of the material world? Is there any good reason to trust the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Did the resurrection of Jesus really happen? These are just a few questions to give you an idea of where to start. Now, obviously, the people who reject the gospel, who reject the Bible, they're going to have answers for these, but I think their answers are less than satisfactory. I think when you start looking at all these things and reading good things that apologists write, you start to see that there's a lot of good reasons to believe the Bible. And that's a way to lift that blindfold off your mind. You study it and you look at it. And the more you study it, the more you begin to believe it. And it's, wow, there's actually something to this. It's not just little kid Sunday school, oh, there's all these miraculous things and no reason to believe it. There are actually reasons for what we believe. And study it out and see if that veil doesn't begin to be lifted off your eyes, so then you can begin to understand and see the gospel more clearly, allowing you then to have faith in it. So that's the first group, the people who don't believe. You have this veil, and this veil stands between you and the gospel. You're not getting it. Start to study it. Just be honest about it and try to study it and see what conclusions you come to. And the second group is the Christians. I'm afraid that oftentimes as Christians, we can put that veil up between the non-believers and the truth and the gospel. And we do that in many ways. One way is that we can just be naive. We don't know. If someone asks us a question for something, we say, I don't know, my Sunday school teacher told me, my pastor told me, I don't know, I saw it on flannel graph somewhere when I was a kid, so it must be true. We're very naive sometimes. We need to understand. That's why we're told in the Bible to be ready to give an answer all the time for someone to ask a reason for the hope that's in us. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things to remember. Sometimes we might have to say, hey, I know there's an answer. I just don't remember it right now. Let me get back with you on it. And that's completely fine. But we need to be able to have some kind of an answer for people rather than, oh, I just believe it, so it must be true. That's not going to work in today's society. Sometimes our Christianity is superficial, and people can see that. They can see that, we say, yeah, we believe God, we believe the gospel, but it really doesn't affect our lives a whole lot. I mean, we don't even go to church sometime if there's something else going on. And people see that and they say, well, if this is really supposed to be such a life-changing thing that you've got here, why would I buy into it when you don't even really buy into it other than just what you say? Christians can be hypocritical. We know how we're supposed to act, and I think the world puts a higher standard on us than even we do. And so we can be hypocritical. Again, we can say this is life-changing, this will change your lives. You can be a totally different person, and then we live just like the world. And so we're putting this veil up, and people can't see past Christians even to get to the gospel. So sometimes I think that we are that veil. Okay, so I think it's time to put an end to naive and superficial and hypocritical Christianity and allow people actually to search the gospel for themselves. So there you go. I don't believe that this passage teaches Calvinism. Like, obviously, I don't believe any passage actually teaches Calvinism. So let me know what you think and like this video. If you like it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time. God bless.